Never have a, regular.
We're on 4, 3. Well, good morning in Seattle. Good afternoon here in New York. Good evening to people all over Europe. And hello the following morning in Australia and Asia. All places where I know my guest today, the very inspiring Rick Steves, is known. If you put together the words Rick Steves and travel and do a search, you can find endless things to get you through a very long pandemic in a very inspiring way. That's the word I use on this program. Welcome, Rick, in Seattle.
I'm looking forward to just a nice conversation with you. I've had you on my show a number of times, and I'm happy to turn the tables.
Well, I want our listeners to know something, that I certainly consider you a friend, but our friendship is based not on having spent a lot of time together, because I've been on your radio program a number of times and we read each other's works, and you are inspiring to millions of people. But only when I dug a little deeper, I discovered that we share a birthday 1 year apart. And we both had fathers who were piano tuners, which is really sort of an unusual combination and not very likely.
Oh,
So
that is
we are way.
remarkable, really.
It is. I mean, not many men or women anywhere could say that their father was a piano tuner. And here we are, same birthday. You know who was born on our birthday was Fred Astaire, for whom I was named. And
I didn't know that.
along with a bunch of assassins, but that's for a different.
Yeah, we don't talk about that. Yeah, I used to know some famous historical characters born on our birthday, but I forget. But so your dad was a piano tuner, and my dad was a piano tuner. Did he dream that you would be a piano tuner in his footsteps?
Well, no. I remember him lugging around that bag, and I remember he would take me with him into people's homes. And actually, I met a lot of famous people because he was a great piano tutor here in New York City.
Ah,
And there was the comedian Alan King, and often the famous person in the household was not there, and it would be the maid, the assistant, the spouse
right.
who would receive us. But there would be pictures around, and we'd be fed. And the famous opera singer Licia Albanese, who lived on Park Avenue.
That's so interesting, because we don't have famous people like that in Seattle, but we've got rich people who have fine pianos.
Yeah.
And my dad was the working class tuner. And, we would go into these gated communities and these ritzy places. And I was just a little 6th grader or 7th grader, but it was like, wow, this is the other side of the world there. But my dad lost a little bit of hearing from shooting a gun in the army. So he could not hear buzzes. If there was some little filing of metal that was vibrating, sympathetic vibration or something, it would bug the owner of the piano to no end. And I could hear those as a little kid. So I was his little buzz. I was the buzz finder, and he would play. It would only buzz when you sympathetically with certain notes on the piano, and I would crawl around under the sounding board or whatever and find that little buzz. And that was a very important part of his work.
Well, my dad began as a professional musician in the Depression when he was 13. He played the trombone.
Yeah.
And that's how he met my mother. He, now we're telling stories, before he met my mother, was in the band, a small band that accompanied Doris Day. And they were lovers for 2 years.
Oh,
and here was this Jewish liberal boy from New York City and this mainstream Republican girl from Cincinnati. And
music brings people together.
It really brought them together. And he loved her. He never had a bad word to say about her. But she then moved to California, and he stayed in New York and worked in New York City. I read up more about her to see if I could find anything about them. And I found that she had been married to a trombonist before knowing my father, and that unfortunately he was quite abusive physically. So she liked trombonists. They didn't break up. It was really more about that their career interest took them in different places. And then he met my mom. I was born and so on. And he remained in New York, and he added piano tuning and music editing as a means of not having to travel. And this gets Rick to the key point of our discussion, that I grew up with a mother who likes travel and a father who felt that he had traveled constantly from the age of 13. And what he wanted to do was stay home and go to
Mm,
the beach and read and tend his garden and be a wonderful father, which he was, and changed his life to not travel. I, on the other hand, from practically 4 years old, all I could think about was travel. And dad brought home for me pictures of Italy and especially Venice because I asked to see about
mhm,
Venice.
mm,
And that was the beginning, that my
mhm.
scrapbooks were cutting up pictures and putting together scrapbooks
Wow.
to the places that I intended to go to.
Mm,
And beyond that, at 5 years old, I was put on a plane by my mom to Florida where I had relatives. It was my first flight. I flew alone. I had a tag on me. It was winter. They lived near Orlando, but the plane had an emergency landing in Jacksonville, none of which I understood. To me, I had this pretty stewardess, as they were called then. She gave me hot chocolate. She hugged me. She took care of me. To me, that was travel. And when the plane landed with the thug and she picked me up and carried me off the plane, and I
yeah.
didn't finish my hot chocolate, that's all I could think about.
Oh,
That is my earliest travel memory. So I ask
that's
you,
first class. Yeah.
what is your earliest travel memory?
My earliest travel memory, I grew up right here in North Seattle, looking out at the Puget Sound and the Olympic
Mm.
Mountains. And every Friday after school, we would go somewhere, but we didn't know where we were going to go except for the weather. If the weather was good, we would go north to the San Juan Islands, and we had a little boat, and we'd hop in the boat and go camping in the San Juans. If the weather was bad, we would go east of the mountains,
Mm.
drive over the Cascade Mountains, and it was always sunny on the Lake Chelan side. So every weekend we'd go somewhere. And then my family had a big thing for Hawaii. My grandparents kind of retired in Hawaii. My mom and dad thought that was the ultimate. So, my early childhood was either camping or the occasional trip to Hawaii. And then my dad started, he was the piano tuner. Some old German said, "Hey, you should import fine German pianos." So my dad was ballsy enough to say, "Oh, that's a good idea." And he took me and my mom to Europe to see the factories. We visited the Bösendorfer factory,
Yeah.
the German Steinway factory in Braunschweig. We visited the harpsichord factory in Linz on the Danube River, Sperhacke harpsichords. And we visited Stuttgart, where they make the actions to all the pianos. All the pianos had that in common. The best pianos have a Renner action.
And how old were you?
I was 14.
Yeah.
And it's interesting. I'll never forget it. Bösendorfer is the classic, the most expensive piano in the world, and it's in an old monastery in Vienna. And they brag that they produce 2 pianos per man per year. None of
Mm.
this assembly line stuff. The wood was aged. The felt was for the hammers was carefully selected from sheep from who knows where, and each piano had a personality because it was handmade. And my dad knew the personality of his clients here, for whom he had tuned their piano for a decade, and they wanted to buy this fancy piano. And my dad would literally fly to Vienna, and I played the piano better than my dad, even though my dad was the piano technician. They'd line up all these exciting, shiny black Bösendorfer grands, and I would play each one. Whatever I could play. Edvard Grieg. What is that? Da, da, da,
Piano
da, da, da,
concerto
da.
in A. Yeah.
And and my dad would analyze the sound, and then he'd say, "This one has the personality of my client in Seattle." And my dad would autograph the sounding board, and that piano would be put in a box and shipped to, or I think shipped or flown to Seattle, and then it would go to the customer's house, and it would be a beautiful experience. But boy, I gained a real respect for old-fashioned craftsmanship and appreciation of fine pianos through that. And that was my first exposure to Europe. And after that, I realized I don't need to go camping or to Hawaii anymore. Europe is my playground. And like you, I think I was charmed, seduced by that mix of culture and history and people who really know how to live well, heritage, diversity, all that comes together. And I'm so thankful for that. Otherwise, I probably would have never had a passport.
And the town that you grew up in, was it mixed in terms of where people came from, or was it sort of monochromatic?
It was very mixed. Some were from Norway and some were from Sweden.
That's
This is
okay with me
this
too.
this is where the Scandinavians ended up. That was 50 years ago.
Yeah.
And Ballard in Seattle was famous, where all the old Norwegians hung out. The grandpas would speak Norwegian and eat their Norwegian cakes and so on. And there's all sorts of Norwegian jokes from the old timers in Ballard. If you told somebody in Ballard in Seattle now a Norwegian joke, they wouldn't understand the connection, because Ballard is totally different now. But in 50 years, that sort of thing changes. But we have that Norwegian heritage here.
Well, is that your heritage?
That's my heritage, yeah.
This is something we've never discussed. You and I are going to have to sometime do a show just on Norwegianness, because I'm not one drop Norwegian. However, because some of them can be rather shy, retiring people, not you. And
Right.
I've often been called upon to lecture about Norwegian culture, including in Norway. And I'll make a really long story short, because it would take an hour. But in August of 1992, I was invited to travel on the royal yacht with the new king, Harold, and Queen Sonia, as they sailed around in the Arctic, meeting peoples for the first time. And we went to Sami country, and a yoik is a dedicated song, and they sang a yoik for him and a yoik for her and a yoik for me. And I was given a Sami knife, because the Sami people, what we call Laps, the biggest gesture of trust and friendship is to give you a knife, because it means that they would trust you holding a knife. And this was at a time when people were allowed to travel with knives on airlines. So I took my Sami knife home to New York. Another detail, and then we'll get back to you, but it's really very interesting, is the airline lost my luggage as I was connecting to the Arctic. And I just had one orange striped shirt and a leather jacket and jeans, which I wore for days, because every town closed in honor of the royal visit. I couldn't buy other clothing, and my beard was getting longer. And Harold said, you're getting more attention than I am. And I said, let's make a deal. If you have them open a store in the next town where I could buy some clothing, which frankly, I looked like a Norwegian shepherd or fisherman, I will stop doing interviews. And so it was, but I adore Norway. And part of the reason for that is that my first so-called foreign meal was Norwegian. Every Saturday or Sunday in Brooklyn, my parents took me to what was known as the Norwegian Seaman's House or church, where for about $2 you could have a smorgasbord. And what I learned immediately there was that you don't pile your plate, but you sample things and you see how food pairing and textures and flavors go together. And my initial contact with, quote, foreign food was Norwegian. And I love Ibsen a lot. My favorite playwright. I studied all of his works. And so sometime we can talk about Norway. We can talk about a lot of things. But one of the questions I really want to ask you is, when did you venture out on your own as a traveler?
Well, I was literally on my mom's passport back in the 60s. I guess parents would have a photograph of them with their child on the passport. So I was legal as long as I was with my mom. It's kind of ridiculous, but that was it. I mean, literally. And there was a sort of a eureka moment. I was in the wonderful Copenhagen train station. And to this day, if I'm a tour guide, and I'm walking through a town, I'll walk people through the train station. I just love the energy of a train station. And the Copenhagen station is a classic one, as you know. And I was there, and I was with my mom and dad, and I was just sort of realizing this world is a wide-eyed wonderland. I was a playground just waiting to invite me into it. And I saw travelers just like me, but a couple years older, with rucksacks and year rail passes and no moms and dads. And then I looked at those old-fashioned destination boards where all the numbers, all the letters would tumble down, and it would update, and it would go Copenhagen, or go Berlin, Amsterdam, Stockholm. And those kids looked as free as the wind. And I looked at my parents, and I remember thinking, I don't need you guys for this. Europe can be my playground. And I vowed as a little teenager right then and there that I would go back to Europe every year for the rest of my life. I was a piano teacher then, and kids wouldn't practice in the summer. So I thought, I'm just practical. I'm not going to struggle with this. It's inefficient. I will see you in September when I can teach 12 lessons in 6 hours and make some reasonable income. But until then, I'm going to Europe. So every summer I went to Europe on a piano teacher's budget. And I was learning to travel smartly just by learning from my experience. And I had a recital hall in my piano studio here in my little town. Yeah. And my studio was in the front. My girlfriend taught piano in the back, and we would give recitals in the middle. And every month I would give, or all the time I would be giving travel talks as well as recitals in my recital hall. And eventually I had to choose between being a piano teacher and being a travel writer. But that was as I was a teenager when I realized I could go on my own. The first trip, I've sort of tracked this, Fred. You know, when you're a little kid, your playground is, or your front yard is your zone. Then your mom and dad let you go up and down the street. Then you can bike to the baseball field at the school. Then you could walk downtown for the coin club. That was sort of one of my steps, you know, because I was a coin collector. And then I flew to Europe without anybody, with no safety net, with nobody knew who I was. That was a big deal for a teenager with no money.
How old were you?
I was 18 on my first trip.
Yeah, yeah.
And I was a terrible traveler with no money. I had no sense of nutrition. I was so green. It was so wonderful to be over there, just a stupid street urchin, you know, rummaging around Europe. And then eventually, a few years later, I went on the bus to India. And that was another out of Europe into the developing world. But I remember going to India before any internet or anything like that, with nothing but con artists everywhere. I mean, going across those countries, when you changed money, you didn't know if you're going to get last year's money or this year's money. You were a complete babe in the wilderness, you know. And then you go to these bucket shops, they were called, where, you know, a no-name little place that sells discount airline tickets. And you have only one shot at it, because if you give you their money and they give you a bogus ticket, enjoy India, you know.
Yeah.
But I mean, we did it, and I remember flying home from India with a sitar. I bought a sitar, and I was sleeping in the Frankfurt airport on the way home to Seattle with my sitar sort of lashed to me so nobody would steal it when I was sleeping on the bench in the sitar in the Frankfurt airport. But those were the real adventure trips, because it was new, you were alone, you didn't have a lot of money, no safety net, you know, getting used to being comfortable with the world.
I don't know if you are familiar with the daughter of Ravi Shankar, Anushka Shankar, who is probably now the leading sitar player in the world. And she and I, in 2012, did a program together at the Verbier Festival in Switzerland, which I basically called From Sitar to Guitar, in that gypsy music, what we call gypsies or Rome peoples who are travelers, and that gets us back to our theme, in effect traveled from India, where the gypsies began with, it's a mixed term, but we're using it in quotation marks, inverted commas for my British friends.
Well, in much of Europe, they're called gypsies. I mean,
they're called gypsies, but in fact, as they traveled, the instrument evolved. So when you go to Syria and Lebanon, there's a stringed instrument that's sort of the evolution of the sitar, which by the time we got to Hungary and Vienna was a zither, and in Italy and Spain was a chitarra. But this is all
right? It's connected. I didn't realize that.
And this is all the same music. So Anushka, I spoke, and Anushka had a range of stringed instruments on the stage, and she began with the sitar, I suddenly forgot the word, in India, the sitar. And she evolved the instruments moving west and narrated, and I narrated, and she played. And then she took a Spanish guitar and played flamenco. And before that, played sort of an Italian version of the music. And you could tell that the music and the chords and the impulses were all there. but it was simply the same peoples as they traveled. What can you take with you when you travel? You can take your education, you can take your spirit, and you can take your music. And
Right.
that's what the gypsies did, in
Yeah.
effect.
We can't take a
And
piano, but you can pack
you
a
can't take a
guitar.
piano.
You know,
Unless you're
one of,
Vladimir Horowitz. We were talking about that last week with Evans Barajas, that he would travel with his pianos to Michigan from New York.
is that
Two
right? Yeah.
pianos, yeah.
You know,
But
there's one of my most, sorry, this might be
yeah,
a ridiculous tangent, but I was thinking about traveling with music and cultures and humble cultures. I'm so fascinated by Montenegro, Crna, the Black Mountain,
yeah,
because I think of it back in the dark ages, you know, when these tribes were pushed around by bully groups, and this group of people settled in this haven surrounded by mountains that was really hard to get to, and nobody wanted it, so it was kind of nice to be there. But they had one little trail that zigzagged from the Bay of Kotor on the Adriatic Sea, which is a little cruise port now,
yeah.
zigzag up the hill to this plateau surrounded by the Black Mountains, Montenegro, Crna in the local language. And there's a humble little capital city up there, the historic capital, Centinnia, I think it's called.
Yeah.
And it had one piano in the palace.
Yeah.
And it occurred to me, there would be no piano tuner within 500 miles. The closest piano tuner would be Vienna, I think. And somehow they carried this piano up this zigzag path, which was a donkey path. There was the umbilical cord for this entire nation to the world through the Adriatic. And they carried that piano all the way up this thing. And my dad says, even if you put it on a U-Haul truck and move it 6 blocks, you got to get it tuned again.
Sure.
Well, I don't know how they got it taken all the way up to the top of this place, into the palace. And it sat there, the only piano in Montenegro with no tuner in the whole lifetime of that piano. But I thought, boy, they work hard to get a little music. And a lot of us don't appreciate how nice it is to be able to log on to a great service and enjoy streamed music.
Part of travel, as you well know, is that we imprint memories and images, and they can be selective, which doesn't mean that I'm saying we're lying, but the certain things made more of an imprint. So
Yep.
in Montenegro, what I specifically remember is that trip up. And
You
I
got to
can
drive up the zigzag now.
All right, but
so we've
yours
been on that
actually
road. But
donkey.
the parallel one is just the fake, or the faded echo of the modern one. But
Yes.
you could almost barely get a donkey up it now.
Yeah.
But of course, the modern road is quite nice, even though it is a treacherous zigzag road up to the top.
But actually, this raises an important issue that I know you deeply care about, and so do I. I want viewers to know something else. Rick and I, clearly we connect and we feel a lot of the same things. We did not meet until last December 4th, when Rick was flying through New York and said, we haven't met, we should meet. And I proposed a Swedish coffee bar that turned out to have gone out of business. So we went down the street and we had a very rich half hour and took a selfie to prove that we were actually together. But that was the only time. But nonetheless, I know, because I read you and I listen to you, that you care, as I do, very, very deeply about the environment and the world, and that there is a price for travel that's not just the cost of paying your fare and having a hotel room or having a meal, but a price on the world, so to speak. And a decision that I made when I was a kid was that I would not learn how to drive. And I do not know how to drive. And that has been a rule for me. So therefore, I have to travel the world using either my feet, public transportation. I only hitchhiked once, and it was to a town called Cavallo. I was with a girl who I like very much named Serena, and she told me that Joan Baez was going to be performing in Cavallo on the 15th of August. We hitched a ride from Bologna, where we're living, and we were in a crash. And I just decided this is the last time I'm relying on someone else.
The person who picked you up was a bad driver. Oh,
he was an Italian sports car, and he really liked Serena and wanted me out of the way, and he crashed into a tree.
Oh,
and
no.
So that was it for him.
As a young boy, you actually chose not to drive for environmental reasons, or was there some other reason?
One of the most influential people and books in my life was Rachel Carson, her book Silent Spring.
Right.
You know, I'm sure as a kid you read the National Geographic. I read it every month. And in the mid 1960s, an issue arrived that had waterfowl from Southern California, from near Santa Barbara, covered in petroleum.
Yeah.
There had been a huge oil spill,
Yeah.
and about fighting to save these animals. A year later, when I was 10, 1966, were the floods in Florence and Venice, and I learned about
Yeah.
the so-called Angeli di Fango, the mud angels, mostly Americans, who went and helped clean up Florence and the books
Yeah.
and so on.
That was heroic.
And then there were a whole series of things. And Earth Day was 1970 when I was 14. And all of these things happened. And I just decided
Yeah.
I'm not going to learn how to drive. And I will need to experience the world and meet people in better ways. I'm not shy, obviously, but in better ways when you have to talk to them. And much of what I know you do and treasure is the people you meet in your travels. Correct me if you think I'm wrong, are at least as important as the landmarks and monuments that are on everybody's bucket list.
You know, I think about that a lot, Fred, because my work is to inspire Americans to venture beyond Orlando and to get friendly with the other 96% of humanity. And I employ 100 people here in Seattle, and we work on our guidebooks, on our TV shows, on our guided bus tours in Europe. And the mark of a good TV show is if I can have real people's voices with me walking through the streets, connecting, not with the promotional person from the tourist office, but with somebody who sees you not as part of the economy, but part of the party. And that's really the goal. And when I'm writing a guidebook, I want to open the door so people can not just have a bucket list where they check off a lot of famous sites, but make friends. And then when I'm doing my tours, it's all people to people. We're staying in small family-run hotels. We're eating in mom and pop restaurants. We have a small group. You know, if we go to a little beer festival, and a typical tour would say, oh, there's no place where 20 people can sit together. That's a blessing. You got to mix it up and you got to disperse and you got to have a beer with these strangers. In Ireland, they say a stranger is just friends who have yet to get to know each other. You know, so I was just enthusing about my new book, if I could hold it
yes,
up.
let me see. Okay.
For the Love of Europe. And my favorite places, people, and stories. And this is 100 essays, my favorite 100 essays. And the best essays are the ones that are all about meeting people.
Sure.
That's the mark of a good trip. It's people that carbonates the experience. When my son went to Europe on his first trip after graduation, you know, I love to sit down and say, okay, you're going to see this museum in the morning because it's less crowded. Be sure you take that guided tour, and then don't miss this for the view on the top. And he came back from the trip and he said, Dad, I didn't really do much of what you said, but I made friends in every country. And I mean, he nailed me. I mean, that's what it's all about. That's so much more fundamental than a lot of the other checklist stuff, is making friends in these countries.
So no secret to you that I'm best known for my work on Italy, but I want to talk about other countries for a while. We can talk about Italy too, if you wish.
Yeah.
I'm pretty even-tempered, but occasionally even I need to sort of get out of New York, and I might be a little down or whatever. And when I feel that way, and typically I do it out of season, so-called, I book a flight to Dublin. And I just hang out with the Irish for a few days. And I come home feeling terrific because they are lovely people. And their conversation and their sociability and their humor.
Yeah.
And it's so bracing for me in terms of wonderful people.
You know, when I was writing my guidebook to Italy and England, I would work and work and work, and I would give myself a pub dinner, and then I'd promise I'd go back to the hotel and work and work and work, because it just, I needed time with the laptop to do the writing. And I would promise myself, I'm just going for dinner, just gonna dinner, half a pint, and I'll go back to the computer. It was like battle. I couldn't get out of that pub because people made me drink more and have fun talking. It's so many times in Ireland, I've been involved in a conversation and the sun sets and you're sitting there like you and I are talking now, and suddenly you're talking in the dark and nobody even thought to turn on the lights. It was just, you're so involved in each other. And only in Ireland have I ever hitchhiked whichever direction the traffic was coming on a remote road. I just hop in and they say, where are you going? I say, where are you going? I'm going to Ireland and I'm here, let's talk. And just to be there is amazing. And I always say, if you want Ireland in the extreme, you go to a Gaeltacht. That's a Gaelic speaking region, like a national park for the culture, as you know, where people speak Gaelic first and English as a second language. And that's where that gift of gab is so enthusiastic. And it's such a beautiful thing. I've been thinking a lot about that in my little town, because I'm advocating to have a piazza in the middle of our town with traffic. We've got Main Street comes to Fifth Avenue, there's a fountain, and there's cars driving around it all the time. So I wrote an editorial a couple of weeks ago, and the mayor embraced it. And now we're having this experimental traffic-free weekends. It's like very radical. And it's so funny how stressed out Americans are about not being able to get there by car. And now you can walk, you can hear the wind blowing through the oak trees. You can hear the pitter patter of the fountain. You can hear the children laughing. You can take your dog here. You know, it's quality of living. Yet Americans are so addicted to their car and their efficiency that they can't park the car and walk for a block and a half. But in Ireland, you got that sort of wonderful conviviality in the pubs and with the music. In all over the Mediterranean region, you got that conviviality with the passeggiata and the paseo. And of course, we and I are both Italophiles. That piazza notion, I think it goes all the way back to Roman times. If people wonder why you're so enamored with Italy, I think it's the piazza. It's where everybody comes together.
Well, so-called forum, the Roman forum, it was designed so that, I'm forgetting the Latin word, where the roads meet was the main piazza. And my favorite Italian city, and I went to college there, is Bologna. And at the University of Bologna, or take it back a little bit, Bologna was founded by the Etruscans. So it has an Etruscan design, the Decamano it's called, where there are 5 roads leading from a little square, but then at the other end of the road is the Roman piazza. And they built the Piazza Maggiore, and that's where the food market is, the best food market I know.
Now it's funny because this conversation just reminded me, it's a cool little deja vu of my favorite pub in Galway, and it's called the Crossroads. And there's a painting, a romantic painting on the wall where it's a farm world. There's a little hamlet here and a hamlet there. The Crossroads is where they build a fire and they bring their hooch and they do their dancing and they party. And the Crossroads, before there was even a community, that's where people would gather. And it goes all the way, it's like in Italy too.
I've been to Galway only once. It was in September of 1976. I have a really good date memory, even when I had beer. And that was the first time I tasted Guinness. And I had it there with Galway oysters, which is the local specialty. And to me, my greatest meals in traveling were not in the temples of gastronomy, although in Italy and France, there are these great places, but the very fresh local food. So the prawns from Dublin Bay are so good that I just don't eat prawns and shrimp in too many other places, because the ones in Dublin are so good, and the oysters are marvelous in Galway. You reminded me of a pub. I worked at the Wexford Festival, the opera festival, a few years ago, which is held in October in Wexford. And I knew that the birthplace of the family of John F. Kennedy was nearby. And I thought, well, maybe I could walk, or I'll take public transportation. I set out on a walk in the meadows, and I lost my way. And I went into a pub and I had a glass of something, and I asked the woman publican, how do I get to the Kennedy home? Oh, darling, it's quite simple. You just go down the road until you come to the crossroads, and then you pass O'Bannon's farm. And then once you see the third cow, you go to the left, and directions like that. And then her husband came out and said, don't believe a word she said. She's not been there in 30 years.
You've got a good Irish accent. Every time I
It's
try to do an
totally Irish.
accent, it's crazy. I just cannot do accents of anywhere, but that's
Well, part of
fun to
why I
be able to
asked you
do.
about the people where you grew up is I grew up in New York City. And my parents divorced when I was young. My dad was very present, but they were living separately. And I was looked after by an Irish family while my mother was at work. And I
Ah,
grew up singing Irish songs, and they were quite poor, and we drank tea and ate a lot of toast and jam. And they were so lovely and warm and embracing and so on. And there were about 9 kids, and we were huddled around a table, and little Freddie was with all these Irish kids. And then there were Italian kids, and my first girlfriend was Puerto Rican, my second one was African American, and Bernadette and Diana. I remember all these people because I went into their homes, and there were many Italian Americans. And, you know, as one of the Italian families said, it's like a Jewish home with better food.
yes.
And that stuck. Okay, if you want better food, go to the Italians.
Oh,
And,
yeah.
you know, it was, I feel very fortunate to have grown up in a time and place, no place is perfect, where we were so integrated. And there was a sense for a time of commonality and positivity and looking
Mhm.
forward. And so people like Paul Robeson came to visit, and we were in this circle of liberal leftist people who cared about progress for everyone. And these are
Mhm.
issues that sadly, but importantly, we are addressing. We must address them now because they've been
Mhm.
neglected. And
Yeah.
the term for people not in America that we use here is systemic racism, and it's a real thing. And it took 400 years to build this horror, and it's going to take time to undo it. And we want to do it in a peaceful, I believe, an inclusive way. I'm not getting on a soapbox here, but
Mhm.
um, it is so interesting when one has to interact rather than being sheltered. You used the word gated communities before.
Yeah.
Uh, I would never go to a gated community if I could help it because I love wandering in parts of cities that are
Yeah.
not known. So in Paris, for example, which was what I was going to get to next, this may sound strange because it's counterintuitive, but Paris is my secret city in that I know a couple of people a little bit in Paris. I don't have any friends in Paris.
Mhm.
And I've worked in Paris, but Paris I went to and I studied in when I was 19. And my French is not as good as my Italian, but it's not bad. And I lived in basically a hovel and had a little balcony that looked like it was painted by Vincent van Gogh with a room that was tilted and a terrible bed and a bidet when I didn't know what that was. So my little balcony, if you looked out the side, saw the dome of the Pantheon in the 5th and 6th arrondissement in Paris. And I learned Paris underfoot. The word is flaneur, someone who walks
Mhm.
without intention.
Yeah.
And it is my secret city. I would go there all the time. And still, the way I said about Dublin, um, I tend to go out of season to Paris. I don't particularly tell people I'm going. I will go to a less so-called desirable arrondissement and not the trendy one. On my
Yeah.
most recent visit, I went to the 15th, which is in the southern part of the city, and they built libraries there and their old flour mills, and it's just fascinating.
Deep into
And
the 15th. Yeah, you can just walk in Paris every day with no list of sites and just have a wonderful adventure. It's like no city in Europe. I do
yeah,
that in the developing world a lot. If I'm in India, I'll just walk in a certain direction, or Nepal, just walk in a certain direction. In Paris, it's such an it's a world of its own. It's so beautiful. But like you said, I don't know what you're getting at, but you said you don't know anybody in Paris. It's very interesting to me. I really want to know people, but I, in some countries, I know a lot of people. In other countries, I know almost nobody. I know Italy, people in Italy. I know the social weave of a town in Italy, and I've got no sense of the social weave of a city in another country. And I'm not sure why that is, but I love being part of the community as a traveler from far away. And I can do that in Italy. It's hard to do that. You can do it in Ireland because
Yeah.
I always say Ireland is like Italy with rain. And in Ireland, I get this strange sensation that I'm understanding a foreign language. I
Yeah.
have that disadvantage in Italian, but in Ireland, of course, you can understand. And you got that love of life and that sort of conviviality and that sort of piazza thing in Ireland, like you have in Italy, without the language barrier. So those are the two countries where I know the most people.
Well, I think part of my thing with Paris, there are a few things. One is, although I adore the concept of the Renaissance and the Renaissance man and all that goes with that, I also adore the concepts of the Enlightenment and Molière and Voltaire and a lot of those French writers, Montaigne. And Paris and France has a certain kind of rational sense. The French use the word reason, raisonner, all the time. And somehow, Italy, adore it though I do, it's Paris where I connect to the reasoning, to
So
the sense.
reason, yeah,
Yeah,
reason versus sense. In Italy, they sense things. It's a more
right,
emotional, sensual place, I think.
right. And which that's me, I think that's you too. But another thing, frankly, and this is not boasting, but I'm well known, you are exceedingly well known. And therefore, I like to be in a place where, frankly, no one knows me, not because I'm doing anything illicit, but I feel my most free when I'm in France, in Paris
Yeah,
specifically,
that's good.
because there's a certain way of politesse, politeness, where the language invites you to be cordial, but a little distant, not rude.
Right.
They certainly know how to be sociable and correct, and I like that. But on the other hand, there's a sense of privacy in France that we
Oh,
Americans may talk about a lot, but the French do it a lot better.
everywhere I've filmed, Fred, the one country I have a difficult time with the camera when people are eating is France.
Yeah.
And they're not rude. They just go, no, there's some discretion here. You shouldn't be filming while I'm eating. In Italy, it's like, come on over, No, it's great. But in France, it feels like everybody's having an affair. They just don't want to be seen. And there is
Yeah.
that. It's I think it's an elegance. I respect it totally. It
I love.
frustrates me from a TV production point of view, but I certainly respect it. And
But
we have to. And when we're in France, I have to physically go to every table and say, "Excuse me, do you speak English? We're making a television show for public television in the United States. We're trying to show how beautiful the life here is here on the Loire Valley. Would it be okay if you're in the back of the program as we work?" And they say, "No problem, but you need to ask." And if they
no,
say, "Oh, no, thank you. No, no, no," then we shoot around them.
that's okay.
Yeah.
Um, Americans now, because of the pandemic and people in the rest of the world, but I'm speaking specifically about Americans for the simple reason that we've bungled our recovery.
Mm.
And there are many parts of the country that have huge rates of coronavirus. Washington, your state, and New York, my state, were the first, but we have good governors. Governor Inslee, who I supported for president in Washington, and Governor Cuomo. I did.
Yeah. Good
I
for
sent him
him.
money, and I sent money, and
I
I
did too.
constantly, because he's the great environmentalist,
He's
and
my
that
man.
to
He's great.
me is the number one issue. Say hi if you know him. That
I will.
will always be the number one issue, that and nuclear disarmament, because it's about the whole world.
Yeah.
And frankly, as awful as other things can be,
Right.
on the pecking order, the environment, nuclear disarmament, predominate over something as awful but as necessary as hunger and housing, important though they are.
Right.
And we must address those in a very humane
Yeah.
way. But the environment comes first, and he is by far the most evolved I know on the environment. But anyway, what I wanted to say is that Americans are not traveling now. We can't. Many European countries have said we're not welcome, or if we do come, we have to quarantine for 14 days. And most Americans don't get 14 days of vacation. How, it's true. How do we, and I mean you and I, but also the nation,
Mhm.
address this fact, and how do we become different, not about the pandemic, but about our notions of travel and exploration and discovery?
Oh, I'm not throwing in the towel. When we get out of this, it's going to be essentially the same as it was in the past. I go to France to kiss people on the cheeks and be kissed on the cheeks.
Mhm.
I go to Italy to pack into a piazza and enjoy the passeggiata without any notion of social distance. I go to Ireland to share a Guinness at the bar, not sit alone at a table. And I see people dining out in these bubbles in Amsterdam, so they can be in Amsterdam but be safe. Excuse me. That's a necessary interim kind of thing. For me, the big ingredient we have to have is patience, and then we have to be sensible and embrace science, and realize that these kind of challenges now involve everybody. It's not borders. It's not us versus them. It's not, oh, we don't want higher numbers than you. It's we're all in this together. In the future, the major challenge is you can spend $700 billion every year on your military hardware like we do in the United States. It's not going to make you any more strong. If you took a little bit of that and invested it in modern ways to attack modern problems, which is not the art of the deal and win-lose, it's got to be win-win. It's not building walls, it's building bridges. It's not shaming the United Nations, but it's embracing the United Nations so we can work together as a family of nations. That's fundamental. That's not liberal. That's just common sense. And we're in a transitional period now where there's a lot of frightened, less educated, greedy people without passports that are a stumbling block towards the new sensibility, which is how we live together with so much affluence on this planet in a way that is honest and sustainable, and taking care that we need stability. We need stability north of the border and south of the border. And the problem south of the border is going to spill into our border no matter how tall we build our walls. So I just think it's an exciting transitional time. And, it's a terrible time for me as a tour operator.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm trying to employ 100 people here. I got zero revenue and 100 people on my payroll. So this is not a good year for Rick Steves Europe. Last year was a great year. We took 30,000 people to Europe last year.
Wonderful.
We had 24,000 people signed up, Fred, to go on our tours this year. I've got 150 guides in Europe that are freelancers that are without work right now. And we've spent the last 2 months just processing refunds. It's full time to be going in reverse financially. We're not designed to do that. And I'm fine with that. You take the good years with the bad. I'm okay. I can suffer through.
It's like making wine.
It's right. I guess it's like making wine. That's a very good analogy. So we'll get through this. But the irony is, those of us who have these, somehow they've got some whatever amendment right to go out and spread this virus. It's just making it worse. And our friends in Europe, I've been saying this for months, is that the irony would be if, because of our lack of leadership from the top down in our country, with this passion for America first, if everybody else has gotten past the virus and learned how to live with it smartly, they open up their borders, but they will not let Americans in because we're the basket case on this. Yeah. I thought that would be the worst scenario. That's exactly what's happening right now. And we're going in the opposite direction as fast as we can with whatever leadership we have on the top. It's taking us in the wrong direction. And I don't know what motivates them, but the future is going to be, the United States is going to be the last country welcome as the rest of the world starts to travel together. And I find it really disappointing. Let's just put it that way. But I think there's the only remedy is at the voting booth.
You and I were talking recently, and I told you that one of my mottos is better 6 feet apart than 6 feet under. And really another one that I've been using more recently and thinking about in terms of political thinking, and I plan to write a letter to the Biden campaign about this, is that to repair the world, we have to start by repairing ourselves. And that's going to take a lot of work in this country. One of our advantages is we are phenomenally diverse. and we have people from everywhere in all the languages and cultures and foods, and we just need to adjust the gears a little bit so that we understand that we really are all Americans. Yes.
Well, that's what is our motto, e pluribus unum, right? We
Yes.
celebrate our diversity. Diversity is what makes us pithy. It makes us strong. It makes us resilient. It makes us creative. It gives your life more colors. It's a what when you travel, you realize this is something to embrace. When you don't travel, you're just ingrown. And I thought we were making great strides on that. I gotta say, I don't know what the right word is. I love my country. God, God bless America. When somebody says God bless America, I think as opposed to what, as opposed to Canadians, like why would God bless America more than Canadians or Mexicans? It just makes no sense to me, especially if somebody calls himself a Christian, because if you're a Christian or a person of faith, you believe there is a God. And if there's a God, he created all of us, and he didn't create favorite children and less favorite children. We're all children of God together. So this is a whole new approach to things, but we've got to get our act together here and recognize that we have strength in our diversity, embrace our diversity. And man, there's a lot of vested interest and a lot of fear and a lot of inertia that we have to overcome, but we've had quite an exciting month now. And I think that the whole notion of diversity as part of our strength can get some traction and be recognized as a plus. But silence is violence, I guess, is a good phrase also.
Because as you know, I don't drive, but also because I adore Europe and traveling in general, realized a long time ago that there are places close to where I live that I don't know. So for example, I live in New York City. I've never been to Cape Cod, Martha's Vineyard, Nantucket, and I love the seacoast. It's my favorite. I love where you live in your part of the world in the Pacific Northwest. I adore it, but I've not been to our equivalent. I've been to Maine twice, many, many years ago. I don't know the Delaware and Maryland coasts very well. And I love the fish of the northeastern seaboard and the culture and the history and so on. So one place that I went to a couple of years ago, because I thought it was very important for obvious reasons, was Walden Pond, where Henry David Thoreau wrote. And I just pulled it off the shelf the other day in preparation to talk to you. And he said, be a Columbus to whole new continents and worlds within you, opening new grounds, new channels, not of trade, but of thought.
That's really good.
Yeah, and that's my new motto.
I was listening to some of the music that you recommended I listened to before our our discussion here. And I was listening to
Rafe Vaughan Williams.
Rafe Vaughan Williams, yeah. And I kept thinking of the great poets of the Cumbrian Lakes district. And they would go walking, and they would go with their satchel and with their notepads and with their palettes and their canvases or whatever to Europe as travelers. And they were traveling with that same philosophy to learn, to embrace, to celebrate nature and culture, and in a much more humble time where you had to, it took a week to get to London and then another week to get to Paris. But they did it in a way that inspired so much great thinking. And the music had me thinking of that. And now in this crisis where a lot of us are locked in and we can't do our traveling, it is a nice reminder that we can grab our satchel and pick up our notepad and walk around the block and have a travel experience. There's great ways to in my radio show, I get to talk to people all the time, like you, who have a passion and a certain angle on things. And I get to talk to experts on the national parks, or I get to talk about experts on bird watching, or I get to talk about experts on, the environmental impact on polar bears or whatever. And it's just so fun because it reminds me there are so many angles you can have on travel. And okay, you can't go to Europe for a while. You can go to, you can go to the national park. You can go river rafting. You can walk around the block. I'm taking travel down to a micro level because this is my world right here. I've had 90 dinners out of the last 100 nights at this table I'm sitting at right now. This is with the same person. This has never happened since I was a toddler. You know, I look but my travel, I'm trying to take my travel spirit and turn it inside out, but still have it feisty right here. And there's totally new stuff. I'm looking right now at our little hummingbird feeder. I've never looked at a hummingbird in this hemisphere, and now they're my little buddies. I think I was joking with you earlier. I never cooked. It's embarrassing how I never made pasta in my adult life. Never made pasta. I've never felt the beautiful feeling of a knife cutting through a crispy onion until now.
Yeah.
That's an adventure. I've
Do you
never
cry when you cut through the onion?
No, I don't cry. I'm joyful. I love cutting onions. What I do is I worry about cutting my fingers off because it's a slimy little creature, that onion, you know, and you got to be careful because I find the kitchen very dangerous. My shirt could fall into the thing on the stove there and I could burst into flames. So I'm careful in the kitchen because I think it's one of the most dangerous places in the world for a klutz like me. But I cuddle with my girlfriend's dogs in the evening. I never cuddled with dogs since I was a little boy. Every night the sun goes down and I'm watching it because, you know, you can see as the days get longer and shorter, the sun sets at a different mountain here on the Olympic Mountains just across the way. And when the sun's halfway out of sight, I get out my trumpet. And my trumpet, I haven't wiggled the valves for 30 years, so my trumpet is now a bugle. It only plays the overtone series. And I play taps for my community as the sun disappears. Nobody would ever know I played the trumpet. Nobody would ever think of me with dogs or cooking or worried about, you know, the inventory in my refrigerator. Flowers, I didn't put these flowers out for our interview. I buy flowers now when I go to the grocery store, you see. It's a beautiful thing. And it's all, I don't regret the other approach when the world's my playground, but if the world's not my playground, my life here can be my playground with the same spirit.
Well, travel and music are the things I love most. I love eating. I love my friends and family. I think that we all have to take every opportunity to learn, and there's no sell-by date on education. And so what I've been doing here where I live is I'm a good cook. I've written 6 cookbooks and I'm thinking of writing another now. And I've been testing recipes. And every day or night, I put a photograph of the dish I've created on Facebook where people follow me and outlines of a recipe, which I have to fine tune. And I get feedback from people who talk about what they've used and techniques that they have. And it's been very interactive in terms of the creation of my recipes. And I have eaten well, and when I travel to Europe, I eat out, but also, frankly, I'd love to know what you do. I try to settle in a place in Europe rather than move from place to place and live the town, know the markets, the bars, the dry cleaners, and so on, and buy the local foods. And the only thing I do ahead of time is research when a particular ingredient is particularly favored. So we're talking about onions. There is an onion that grows near the Bay of Biscay in the Basque Country that has a limited season. There are only 9 women who grow these onions. And it's in a town near a town called Hernani, and named for an opera. And I tend to go there if I want to learn the local onion sauces. And I talk to all the people in the town, in the markets, especially about how do you use these onions and what are their special properties and so on. And my education in terms of my food writing is I never went to chef school. It's really talking to people what they do and then taking it home. To which I'm just going to add a further point. If you start young and if you don't have fear about things, we all have fears about certain things and we should. I believe that those are the things we tend to excel in or love. So I cooked from a very early age. I traveled and wanted to travel in my mind, but then tangibly from an early age. I forgot to tell you, when I was 9, for about a year, I would go sleepwalking every night, and they tried to figure out why I kept leaving my house. And it was already this travel urge. And
Wow.
someone with such a travel urge, you can imagine now, when I have not seen 72nd Street here in New York City since February. And I, normally I was supposed to be I
Yeah.
worked in London in March. I was supposed to be in Paris for my annual Paris excursion in April, and I had work in Milan in May, all of which canceled. And I was supposed to work
Yep.
in Salzburg at the festival in August,
Mm.
canceled. And, okay. But I want to mention one thing, and then we'll continue. I created an interesting list in honor of Rick, of music that I find inspiring, either about travelers or invitations to travel. So Ralph Vaughan Williams' Songs of Travel, sung by Thomas Allen, all of this is on Idagio. Magnificent music and words. Henri Duparc, L'Invitation au Voyage, an invitation to a journey. Gustav Mahler's Songs of the Wayfarer, sung by Idagio's own Thomas Hampson. Richard Wagner's Siegfried's Rhine Journey. Now, this is a journey after he's died or dying. And it's amazing music. And it doesn't depict the Rhine, but it depicts transition, the journey of one phase of life to the other, whether we call it death or whatever, that phase. In Rick's honor, Tchaikovsky's Capriccio Italien, which so beautifully expresses Italy. George Gershwin's An American in Paris, which is how I feel, and I think you feel too. Noel Coward, his song I Travel Alone. And because I did know that you play the trumpet, even though you didn't tell me, I added the Haydn Trumpet Concerto, which was my first favorite piece of music. So
Wow. Good.
travel can inspire musically, and music can inspire travel. And I want to ask you, I know that you love visiting concert halls and theaters and have done programs about places where people gather for music and performance. Would you talk about that interest and what you've done in that regard?
Well, I'm nowhere near, I'm not sophisticated at all in my understanding of classical music, other than I just enjoy it. And I enjoy it a little extra when it fits with the architecture. I just love to listen to a great Baroque performance in a Baroque hall. There's some beautiful Baroque halls in Salzburg, and it just feels right.
Yeah.
Also, I found that if I'm trying to appreciate music or art or literature or whatever, if I can put myself in a contemporary mindset of when it was created, that's a real challenge. And if you can do that, you have an advantage, and it makes it more real. It makes it more, you have more empathy for it, or something like that. And it goes to history as well. I'm inspired and fascinated by Giuseppe Garibaldi. My friends can't understand why I even care about Garibaldi, but I can imagine. I care about Garibaldi. It's a weird thing, but I know, I can imagine how tough it must have been to be a downtrodden nation, broken into parts, dominated by other powers that didn't want that nation intact at the table. And Garibaldi pulled it off.
Rick, I'm going to interrupt simply because you and I live by the clock, and this has been the fastest hour in world history. I just want to add one thing about Garibaldi. He lived in Staten Island for a while. And next time you are here and we have more than a half hour, I'm going to take you to a restaurant in New York that's not well known, associated with Garibaldi's son.
I'd love to go. That's good.
And in the meantime, I know that many Idagio listeners and viewers may not have known of Rick Steves if you're in Europe, even though he's in Europe more than you are practically. I hope this was a moment of discovery for you, listeners. Yes, sir.
If we could mention just briefly, forgive me for this plug, but I produced a 1-hour TV show called A Symphonic Journey. And I'm fascinated by romantic anthems that are celebrating and inspiring national movements in the late 1800s. So we collected 7 different countries with 7 different beloved composers from the same generation and analyzed how they were part of the nationalist movements in that sweeping Europe in the 19th century, tying romanticism and nationalism together. There's a wonderful introduction to that whole notion, and it's people can watch it for free. It's called Rick Steves' Symphonic Journey. It streams on my website or on YouTube, but it's just a beautiful example of how we can be inspired by the story of Europe and its music together.
And as I've said to you, inspiration is at the heart of this program. And Rick, my friend, I do hope that we get more than a half hour for coffee next time I see you. Thank you for everything you do. You are very inspiring. You make the world better by bringing people together the way we should be brought together. I try to do that too. And everybody, I'm not here to plug Rick. He is there for himself. But if you don't know his work, you really do want to explore whether radio, TV programs, videos, books. Did I leave anything? Take a trip? Did I leave anything out?
I just think
recipes.
You're the only guy I know whose dad was a piano tuner who was born on the same day I was born.
No.
We have some bizarre kind of kindred spiritness there that it's just a delight to talk with you, and it's just like playing ping pong in heaven. You know, I love it.
Ping pong in heaven. I love it. Thank you, Rick. And viewers, listeners, have a good week. Next week, I'm expecting the conductor Emmanuel Villon. So we'll talk about France, about Dallas, Texas. And Rick, I will see you soon. Safe travels.
Take care, Fred. Nice talking.